Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Sheffield United by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, Christian Benteke and Jeffrey Slupp after the game. So let's begin. Crystal Palace's first away game of the new Premier League season saw the Eagles go down by the narrowest of margins, losing 1-0 to Sheffield United at Bramall Lane. The sun was shining at Bramall Lane as the fire cannons exploded to signify Sheffield United's first home game in the Premier League since the 19th of August 2006. However, the rapturous atmosphere was curtailed early on with a few checks from Wilfried Zaha and the opening chance of the game on 5 minutes falling to the Eagles. The ball landed kindly for Christian Benteke on the right inside channel of the penalty box, courtesy of Luka Milivojovic's long ball through to Zaha, with the Alvaran deflecting the ball into Benteke's path. The striker saw his low, near post effort saved well by Dean Henderson. Returning to the starting 11 after his African Cup of Nations exploits and sub-appearance last weekend, Zaha was finding space. Therefore, it was no surprise that our South Londoner was involved in the first yellow card of the afternoon, with John Lundstram getting his name added to the referee's book for manhandling our Ivory Coast international. With no more real moments of note for either team, the game still remained a hotly contested and open affair in the first 20 minutes. A sense of 3 points for either team made a terrific Palace away atmosphere inside Bramall Lane. The openness of the first half was epitomised in the 23rd minute, with the Blades claiming for a penalty via handball. The referee ignored their protest and attention then turned to Andros Townsend, who was breaking at speed with the ball. Despite Chris Basham's best attempts to wear Townsend's shirt, the winger did well to escape the clutches of the Sheffield United defender before releasing Zaha inside the penalty box. Less than 10 seconds from the Blades claiming a spot kick to Zaha eventually winning a corner. Chris Wilder was forced into a first sub substitute, with John Fleck suffering an injury and being replaced by Luke Freeman on 28 minutes. A fitting name for a player entering such an open game at Bramall Lane. Another end-to-end moment arrived in 31 minutes. A promising Palace build-up ultimately ended with a Blades break. However, Scott Dan Marshall coloured Robertson well enough that the striker's effort went over for Vicente Guaita's goal. 3 minutes before half-time, and Wilder's side registered their first shot on target, and one that looked certain to give them the lead, with David McGoldrick unmarked inside the 6-yard box. Enter Guaita, the Spaniard scrambling across the line to block McGoldrick's effort, as most of Bramall Lane rose to their feet for preemptive celebrations. Moments after the restart, Guaita was again pulling off heroics. However, unfortunately for the Eagles' number one, after stopping well from Friedman from close range, the ball fell to Lundstram, who finished into the gaping net. The Eagles responded well after going behind, with Townsend looking to add another trademark effort to his impressive collection, but Henderson got down well to push away the winger's curling effort. With just under half an hour to go, the game saw the introduction of Jeffrey Slupp, with Max Meyer making way for the Ghanaian's first Premier League minutes of the season. Slupp's arrival into the game was followed shortly after by James McCarthy's debut, replacing Townsend as Hodgson tweaked things to look for that equaliser. Hodgson's final sub of the afternoon added firework to the attack, with James McCarthy being sacrificed in midfield for striker Connor Wickham on the 83rd minute. Despite the tactical changes, Palace were unable to find the way to break through the Blades' back line, with the game finishing 1-0 to Sheffield United. So I'm now going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. So if you are someone like myself who does like to follow a vast array of Palace accounts on both Twitter and Facebook, then of course head over to our accounts at Crystal Palace and of course give us a follow there. Now, alongside just general Palace news, whether that be about injuries, about the academy, we obviously do regularly update the account with transfer news, and even though we're not actually in the January transfer window yet, there's still a few rumours coming about maybe possible free transfers or free agents we could bring in, which I don't think we can do, but there's still rumours regarding that, and of course rumours already about players who could be leaving or coming in January. So if you do want a place to keep up to date with all the latest Palace news, but in particular the transfer news, because I think we're quite good at actually sourcing these articles and actually putting them out there as soon as we get them, then of course give us a follow there. And just alongside that, if we do find an interview as well, which we think you guys might find interesting, we'll of course post it on there as well. Whether that's a player interview, manager interview, or even sort of a pundit's interview which we sort of want to share, we of course do that on the account as well. And the final thing really, and this is something which quite a lot of people are quite engaged in, particularly across the summer transfer window, where of course there wasn't any football to talk about, but there was loads of transfers to talk about. That is of course our opinion. So we do regularly update the Twitter account with our opinion, before the game, talking about what we think might happen, reacting to injury news, and of course after the game, giving that instant match reaction before of course I go on to record the podcast. So if you are someone wanting to obviously get involved in all of that, the news side of it and obviously the opinion side of it, of course do head over to the respective sites and of course give us a follow on there. Now another great place to share opinions is of course on YouTube. So if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings, where of course you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10, and that is of course with 10 being the best. Now the reason I want you guys to do that is basically for you guys to share your opinions. So rather than me just having my general view of the game and going through each player individually and just discussing them and giving them the rating, I want you guys to comment below with your thoughts about the players, and so we can compare how we thought the players performed. And when you consider it was a very disappointing performance from Palace, so I say disappointed, I think embarrassing is a better word to use, because yes, Sheffield United were good, but they didn't win the game because they were good, they won the game because of how poor we were. So you're going to look at the game going, actually it's pretty difficult, I don't want to give players ratings, or I'm going to give them such a low rating, because realistically that's sort of how we're feeling after the game. So if you are someone who wants to get involved, particularly if you're listening on YouTube, just comment below with your your player ratings, and even if you don't want to do that, comment below with your general views of the game, because of course it was an embarrassing performance like I've already said, but actually if you're if you're a Sheffield United fan, you're going to be absolutely delighted. Your first home game in the Premier League for God knows how many years that they've been away, so they're going to be absolutely ecstatic with it, not just with the result but the actual performance as well. Whereas Palace perspective, no player stood out realistically. Maybe you could say one or two maybe did, but on the whole a disappointing team performance. They didn't seem to show any sort of determination, any grit. And in terms of the fight, you've gone 1-0 down, you want to try and get back into the game, and it obviously stayed 1-0 for the rest of the game, because we didn't have that intent, we didn't have that fight to at least try and get back into the game. And maybe you could say it's because Sheffield United defended well, but I just think it's all down to Palace's poor play. So whether you want to share your opinion on players in particular, or of course just your general views of the game, of course feel free to do that in the comment section below. And like I've said, it's so that I can read it, I can see what you guys thought about the game, and also I will comment back with you. So if you want a bit of a discussion, have any questions, of course feel free to do that in the comment section below. Now if you do want to follow any of the social media pages that I've mentioned, or join our Facebook group, then do check all the links that will be in the description below. I'm now going to move on to my player ratings, starting to go with Vicente Guaita, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now Guaita's performance it was quite an interesting one, in the fact that I've given him a 7 where I've already talked about it being an embarrassing performance. But realistically the reason I've given him a 7 is because he made numerous important saves throughout the game, particularly sort of in that first half period to get us into half time at 0-0. And whilst we obviously conceded that early goal and he was one of the players who was at fault for that, his performance as a whole was significantly better than most of the players in the team, hence why I've given him a 7. And this is something I've said quite a lot last season, and I repeated it last weekend, in the fact that Guaita always makes important saves, he's that safe pair of hands, and just sort of instills confidence in the side. And that's exactly the performance we got here at the weekend, in the fact that he made the important saves when he had to, and that was all down. The reason he had to keep making these saves is just because our defence was very, very lacklustre, and obviously meant that he was repeatedly being tested by the United players. And luckily for us, nothing came off of it other than the goal they scored. But still, we really shouldn't be putting Guaita in a situation where he has to make all of these really good important saves, because if the defence were doing their job properly, then we wouldn't find ourselves in that situation. Now there was one with McGoldrick, he probably should have done better with it. Guaita was able to catch the ball and then bring it into his chest, really great save from close range, and arguably maybe the player should have done better with that chance. But that was one save in particular which really stands out for me, and realistically that was the only highlight from what was a very disappointing game. Now obviously Guaita done well in that situation. But moving on to the goal we conceded, obviously there were loads of players we could talk about. We could talk about Joe Ward, obviously the player going on his inside and Joe Ward was nowhere to be seen. We could talk about maybe players like Villano actually playing so narrow that the player was really easily able to get into the box and obviously score the goal there. We could talk about someone like Luca who was also sort of in the vicinity there. Maybe he should have done better, at least make a challenge, put himself in front of the ball. And of course Kelly and Dan as well, you could talk about them as well and say maybe they should have done better for the goal. But in terms of Guaita's contributions to the goal, obviously the ball's come into the area, been a little nick on it from close range. Guaita's gone to parry it away, which was good. That was fine. But what he's done, he's parried it right into the area where the Sheffield United player is, and of course he's gone on to score. So obviously, whilst throughout the whole game he was making really good saves, keeping us in the game, but obviously on that occasion, rather than putting the ball into a safe area, he's just put it back into the danger zone and scored. But like I've said, I've already listed loads of other players who were at fault for that goal, and realistically, you can't blame Guaita in that situation, because realistically the defence should be doing better, because he's done his part, albeit not necessarily that well. But obviously because of the players around him ultimately meant that we were punished for that. But like I said already, I think Guaita is fully deserving of the 7 I've given him, mainly because of the important saves he made in that first half. But like I said already, not really much he could have done about the goal we conceded. So I do think overall the 7 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our defence, and that is the right back Joe Ward, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, obviously this could be one of the other controversial ones in the fact that maybe a 5 is a little bit too high considering how poor the defensive performance as a whole was, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because, you've got to look at the whole team performance, and it wasn't just him being bad, it was just maybe other players around him also playing bad sort of affected his performance. So I do think the 5 overall is a fair reflection. Now, obviously, before we talk about his performance, there was a moment with the VAR where, of course, it looked like he'd handballed the ball, but it sort of came off his elbow, and his hand was in this sort of it was between an unnatural and natural position. It was sort of by his side, slightly sticking out, and obviously the ball just struck off his elbow. But because it wasn't a clear and obvious thing, and because I don't think even with the new sort of handball rules, it would have been given, VAR wasn't used, and of course they didn't get the penalty. But nevertheless, it's just a moment in the game which sticks out for me because it was such a boring game that the 2 things I've picked out so far is a save from Guaita and a handball incident which involved Joe Ward, which really goes to show how poor the game was in the fact that they're the two sort of moments I've picked out so far. Now, in terms of the goal, like I've already said already, he lost his man for that goal, but on the whole, aside from the goal, he didn't really look comfortable at right back, and I gave him a lot of credit against Everton last weekend. He played alright then, but this was sort of a performance where he took a step backwards, didn't look very comfortable, was getting run ragged by the Sheffield United players. And whether it's just one of these off games or whether this is sort of just once again showing that he's a good player to have on your bench, but he isn't quite good enough to play in the Premier League anymore, or certainly to the standard that we, the opposition were going to come up against. Whatever that will be, he didn't really look that quite comfortable there. But talking about the goal, completely lost his man there. And God, obviously you don't like reviewing and watching back the goals you concede, but I've watched it so many times and I'm like, what are you doing? Just keep with your man rather than trying to turn him on the outside. Just stick with him rather than trying to do that. And what does he do? Tries to sort of get him to play on the outside. He just cuts inside, sends Ward the other direction, and then he's able to put the ball into the box to score from there. And once again, obviously the goal as a whole from the whole team was disappointing, but Ward in particular, in the past he's been very good at just putting his body in the way and stopping crosses coming into the area. But last sort of season, maybe even season and a half, that's one part of his game which has really been lacking. And as we saw here, it was to our detriment in the fact that we ended up conceding from it. He was a bit fortunate later on, or with a high foot on McBarney. I'm not really going to talk too much more about that, but that's another moment in the game which I suppose you've got to pick out in the fact that he was a bit fortunate there. But overall, there's not really much I can say about many players in the team considering how bad the performance was. But Ward here, I think the 5 is a fair reflection. No real good moments here, and certainly was at fault for that goal, or one of the main players at fault for that goal. But once again here, hopefully we have a better performance from him next week. Obviously a big game at Man United, but aside from that, it goes back to that point yet again that we didn't sign a right back to replace Anwar Wan-Bissaka in the transfer window, and now it seems to be coming back to actually hurt us in the fact that our only right back isn't really performing well, and maybe we need another Wan-Bissaka to come through the academy who can actually just take Ward's place or give him a bit more competition, because at the moment it's looking like that Ward isn't quite up to it like he used to be. But once again here, I do think the 5 I've given him is a fair result. Now I'm going to move on now to one of our first centre back, and that is of course Martin Kelly. Now this is another one which could be a little bit controversial in the fact that our defensive performance was quite poor, but I am going to give him a 5 overall. And I was debating whether 4 or 5, but I do think a 5 overall is a fair reflection. And it was mainly just because it was an average performance from him. And, obviously Kelly and Dan, yes, they were involved in the goal, but they weren't directly involved in the fact that, we could say Joe Ward definitely was at fault for the goal because he let his man put the cross in. Guaita was at fault as well because he parried the ball into the danger area. And, of course, you've got to look at someone like PVA going, actually, you lost your marker, you were playing too narrow, and obviously he went through and to score the goal. So you're looking at that, you can pinpoint exactly why these guys were at fault, whereas Kelly and Dan, yes, they were still quite average in the game, but for that goal in particular, because they were obviously the central players, because the ball came from out wide and the player running in came from out wide, or certainly not exactly at the centre, it was down to the fullbacks to do better in that situation. So realistically, not much more I can say about Kelly's performance. Had a few scary moments, I suppose, where he was put under pressure by United's players, but the fact that he just came through it, I was able to persevere in what was an overall very disappointing team performance, is something you want to see from a player. And I've said this loads of times last season, if a player's I'd rather a player have an average game than actually, and at least try, as opposed to having just a complete terrible game. And that's exactly what we saw with Kelly's game here, in the fact that yes, he wasn't great, but at least he was just putting in an average performance just to help us see us through the game. And, like I've said, isn't really much more I can say about him. But overall, I do think the 5 for Kelly is a fair result. Now moving on to the second centre-back, and that is of course Scott Dan. Also going to give him a 5. And to be honest, much like what I said with Kelly, a really average performance from them both. And most of the stuff I've already said can be repeated. Nothing too special, but still, you could say, given the fact that the team performance was so bad, we just needed someone to actually step up and make the difference, and maybe someone like Dan or Kelly could have been the difference there, because in what was an overall really bad team performance, you need someone to have that defensive solidity to make sure you don't concede that goal, and just give you that defensive basis and that sort of base to actually start up your attacks by having that solid defence. But that was missing in the game here, and it wasn't just because Kelly and Dan weren't playing well, is because the whole team weren't playing well. And this is going to be a recurring theme, but I think that certain players, they weren't necessarily that disappointing because they weren't weren't terrible, hence why I've given Kelly and Dan 5s. But I do think if the other players around them would have just helped them out a bit more, would have put them under a little bit less pressure defensively, and maybe we would have come out with a much better performance. But overall here, Scott Dan, not really much more to say about him, so I do think the 5 is a fair result. Now moving on to Patrick Van Aanholt. Now obviously he's a player who's been mentioned quite a lot already, and considering I haven't talked about him in particular, obviously means he's a topic of discussion from this game, and I am going to give him a 4 overall. Now in terms of who he was playing against, obviously he was the left back for the game, playing up against the right midfielder George Baldock, and you know what, he ran him ragged for the whole game, and he was a handful for him, particularly when he was whipping in dangerous crosses. And that's something we've criticised Van Aanholt for quite a lot, particularly last season. And this was a game where, yet again, it was disappointing in the fact that rather than just putting his body in the line or trying to get in the way of crosses, he was letting players get around him too easily or was playing too narrow, and eventually balls will be able to get into the box. And that put people like Dan and Kelly under lots of pressure, because realistically, you want to at least try to stop the balls coming into the area, and if they do, you at least want to sort of get a deflection on it to get it behind for a corner or put it out of play, whatever it is. But we didn't even see that in the slightest from Van Aanholt here. And whilst normally I talk about him being quite disappointing defensively, but sometimes he's good offensively, this was a game where both his defensive and offensive work were very, very poor. He wasn't effective going forward, and the few times I did see him going forward, all he was doing 1-2s or passing the ball from a central position out wide to Zaha, or when he was playing at sort of quite wide and Zaha was drifting inside, he'd try and pass the ball to him. So literally all he was doing in an attacking capacity was just passing the ball between him and Zaha. So realistically, You know, normally he's one of these players who, yes, he can be poor defensively, but can pull something out of the hat offensively. But this game, both his offensive and defensive play were, of course, really disappointing. And, of course, going back to the goal, which I've already talked about already, obviously the ball's come into the box. Guaita's made the save, parried it into the area, which, of course, danger area. He really should be doing better. But likewise, Vanano, rather than playing so narrow as he did, if he'd been playing in the correct position and if he had been tracking the run of the Sheffield United player, he would have been able to get there. And even if he did still score, if you're looking back at the replays, at least it would have looked like he's at least trying to get there rather than sort of just drifting in the area and just letting the Sheffield United players sort of drift around and easily get on the end of that ball. But like I've said already, really disappointing performance from Vanano playing at left back. Obviously at fault for the goal in terms of not tracking his player, but also just the whole game really. You know, he was leaving too much space down that left flank, making it very easy for Sheffield United to put balls into the box. And of course that put us under quite a lot of unnecessary pressure defensively. But once again here, Vanano, I do think he does deserve the 4 I've given him. Now I'm going to move on now to the captain and obviously the first player in our midfield, and that is Luka Milivojevic, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now once again, you know, I've given a few 5s and 4s already, and that really goes to show how average or how bad and embarrassing our performance was. But I think Luka was one of these players who he wasn't necessarily directly involved with that, and he just had a fairly average performance, done what he had to do, but realistically wasn't helped out by the fact that the rest of his teammates weren't playing that great. Now obviously when you're not playing that well, when you're actually meant to be that anchor in front of the back four, and you know, you're basically sitting in as the base in the midfield, that's not an easy job as it is. But when your defensive players aren't playing that good, and you know, they're, you know, the midfield as well is just constantly attacking you, the midfield of the opposition, obviously not going to make life easy. And certainly for Luka, seems to be one of these players who suffered in the fact that the way that Sheffield United play, they have overlapping centre-backs, and you know, that allows them to push quite far forward and have that high press. And obviously them sort of marauding runs and the defenders coming out obviously made life difficult for Luka. But like I said already, he was fairly average in the game, dealt with it alright. Like I've said already, because the rest of his teammates weren't really playing that well, meant that he wasn't really able to deal with that pressure as well as he normally would do, because normally he loves a crunching tackle here, break up play, disrupt play and pass the ball forward. And whilst on a few times we saw him pass the ball out wide to someone like Benteke or someone like Zaha, that was all good, but because the rest of his teammates weren't playing that well, and just because he was put under so much pressure by the overlapping defenders that Sheffield United have, that sort of formation, that sort of way they play in midfield obviously made life difficult for him. And yes, he dealt with it well, but he probably could have dealt with the pressure from the midfield players in particular even better, if of course he wasn't put under as much pressure as he did because of other players around him not playing well. So once again here, I do think Luka Milivojevic does deserve the 6 I've given him. Now I'm now going to move on to the second midfielder, and that is James McArthur, who I'm also going to give a 6. Now once again, he's a player who some people may give 4s or maybe even 5s, and I've given him once again the benefit of the doubt, because I think both him and Milivojevic obviously had their work cut out because of the way that United have their overlapping centre-backs, and that allows them to get forward quite a lot and it allows them to play a high press. And yes, that's quite difficult to deal with, but given the circumstances and given how bad the rest of the team were playing, I think McArthur and Milivojevic were 2 players in particular who sort of persevered and at least tried to create something, or at least do something and be combative in the midfield. And that's something that, you know, yes, sometimes it's fairly average from McArthur, but at least we saw him trying in this game in comparison to other players. And I talked earlier on about having no fight, and the team, as soon as we went 1-0 down, we couldn't really get back into it. Whereas McArthur, as much as people sort of use him as a scapegoat sometimes, I don't think in this instance you can really blame him, because his life was made difficult because of, firstly, how Sheffield United played, but also just the lack of support from other players around him. Now, obviously, once again, I've talked about Joe Ward, but McArthur himself had a handball appeal against him dismissed. Not really going to talk too much more about that. And of course, because he, you know, towards the end of the game, getting a bit tired, it was ineffective. And realistically, the game had already gone by that point. He obviously got substituted for Connor Wickham quite late on in the game. No real impact there, because it didn't really seem to make a difference to the way we played. So once again here, James McArthur, you know, yes, some people give him 4 or 5s, but I've given him the 6 because at least he tried, and yes, they had their work cut out, but at least he sort of persevered to do something with it. But like I've said, I probably could have given loads of these players maybe even, you know, 1 below the actual rating I've given them, because of that just reflects how poor and embarrassing our performance was. But once again here, James McArthur, I do think he does deserve these 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to obviously the final player in our midfield, and that is Max Meyer, and obviously a player who I praised a lot against Everton because he played so well. Lots of expectation coming into this game, but actually it was an overall very disappointing performance, and I've given him a 5 for that. Now obviously we talked last week about how effective he was going forward, and he was sort of the architect of all of our good work going forward, and of course he had a few chances himself to score against Everton, whereas in this game it was a complete juxtaposition in the fact that he was very ineffective, particularly in that first half where, yes, Sheffield United were getting going, but we had a few good chances going forward, but Max Meyer wasn't involved in them. You know, the few times we got the ball into their half and into their penalty box, Max Meyer wasn't really involved in that, whereas last weekend you rewind to then and he was involved in everything in and around the box, which shows the complete change in his performance. And you know, normally, as we've seen in recent games with him, and particularly in pre-season, he's been that creative spark in the team. He's been that guy who can actually in attack bring the ball from the defence into the attack, and he's done that fairly well, whereas in this game we were really missing it. And if we had someone like him just giving us that creative spark, we might have been able to break down Sheffield United even easier, because they're playing sort of a back 3 or back 5 with their full backs, if you include, or the wing backs if you include it in there. So of course it was going to be difficult for us playing up against 5 mainly defensive players. So we really needed Max Meyer to step up and be that creative spark, but he wasn't exactly that. And I think it really epitomised his performance in the fact that he got replaced by Jeffrey Schlupp just after the hour mark. So you've got a player who's just come back from injury, and obviously isn't 100% fit, and he's actually being put on the pitch as opposed to one of our most creative players. And I think that really did sum up Meyer's performance in the fact that because he was so ineffective, it didn't really make a difference if you brought our sort of best creative player off the pitch. And you know, realistically, yes, maybe people would be saying maybe take McArthur off because he doesn't give us that attacking contribution like he used to, and maybe that's true. Maybe we should have kept Max Meyer on and maybe took someone else off in attack, but nevertheless got replaced by Jeffrey Schlupp and really just epitomised what was an overall disappointing performance. And you know, he's not going to be dropped from this because obviously we've seen how good he was against Everton, but it obviously begs the question with players coming off the bench now, people like James McCarthy, obviously Camarasa to come into the side, and of course Guaita obviously on the bench. We've got options there now who could come into the midfield, so performances like this are really going to make it not difficult, I suppose, for Roy Hodgson to drop Max Meyer, because that's what he seemed to love doing last season. So realistically, we want to keep Max Meyer in the team, but performances like this are really going to sort of put his place in the side at risk, just because of the options we've now got. Because yes, we were really sort of hoping for him to be that creative spark, obviously on Sunday, but he wasn't, and arguably combined with our defensive performance was one of the reasons we weren't able to get anything from the game, because we were obviously missing that sort of key player in terms of our attack. So once again here, Max Meyer, probably some people would give him a 4, but I gave him a 5 as a benefit of the doubt. Now of course I'm going to move on now to Andros Townsend, obviously the first player in our front 3. I'm going to give him a 5 overall, and once again another player who could have been given a 4 just because of how ineffective he was in the game, but I do think the 5, once again, benefit of the doubt, is a fair rating. Now before I go on to talk about his performance, I might as well talk about he's been nominated for the Puskas Award. Obviously it's one of the 10 final nominations for the award, and you know, obviously he won the Premier League goal of the season, he obviously won Palace's goal of the season, and it was a fantastic strike against Man City. So I thought I'd just put it out there. I'll put a link in the description below so you can vote for him, but wouldn't it be great for him at least to get into sort of the top 3, you know, best goals scored last season, because he certainly does deserve it. You know, obviously the goal itself was fantastic, but also the occasion, the fact that we beat the champions at their own place, and obviously they went on to win the league anyway, but you know, all of that pressure on the game, and we were able to not only score a fantastic goal but also hold on to win the game. So I do think for the goal itself, the volley, the way he struck it, the timing, the curve, everything about the goal was great, and the occasion was also great. So of course, if you haven't already, go and vote for his goal, and obviously fingers crossed, touch wood, that actually Townsend can go on, even if he doesn't win the award, but just to represent obviously himself, but also representing Palace, representing England, because of course he's the only English player being nominated this year, and of course representing the Premier League as well. So wouldn't it be great to actually have not even like just have a Premiership player actually win the award? It'd be great to have an Palace player, be represented in such a prestigious award. But moving aside from that, moving on to his performance on Sunday, obviously one sort of chance which stands out for me is when he forced a decent save out of Henderson quite early on in the game. Obviously Townsend tried his trademark move, trying to curl the ball in, but obviously it probably would have been a good goal if he had scored it, but of course Henderson was able to make the save, proving once again that actually Henderson, as we saw in this game here, quite a number of times he kept Sheffield United in the game. And that's what you want from your players. You want them to, at key moments, to make saves or to make tackles to actually keep us in the game. And that's what we were missing from our performance. We were missing that fight and determination, which of course promoted teams normally have anyway, but we should have at least tried to match it, which we didn't. So of course, great save by Henderson early on. But aside from that, the rest of the game he was fairly quiet. And I talked about Ward getting run ragged. Townsend as well, not giving that protection, not giving that cover in front of Joe Ward, obviously made his life more difficult. So if Townsend had chipped in a little bit more defensively, then maybe we could have had a different result in that respect. But then you've got to also look at it in the fact that he's a winger, he should be doing his attacking work and leaving the defenders to it. So obviously there's two sides to that story. I personally, in a game like this where the opposition are playing back three or back five, if you include the fullback, you need support defensively from your wingers, because that's obviously giving that extra cover to protect against the extra man they have in defence. But arguably, even though he did double down on him a few times down that right hand side, rather than being in that attacking position, that sort of hurt us, because I'd rather him play, say, 10-15 yards further forward and give a little bit less protection to Ward, if it meant that when we go on the counter attack he's actually in an attacking position, as opposed to him helping out defensively, because we're so poor in that respect in the game. And obviously that means that his attacking contribution is obviously limited throughout the game. And once again, talking about substitutions, he came on, of course, about sort of 10 minutes or so to come. James McCarthy came on for his debut, and that was just sort of changing the formation a bit, bringing on someone just to help us see out the game. And realistically, it would have been nice to see a little bit more from Townsend, because we saw last season how much influence he can have, not just the goals he scored, but the creativity he brings to the side, and that determination, and the fact that he played, I think, almost all the games, or I think he played all the games last season. So we know that he's got it in his locker, we know he can be that spark. But this game here, once again, was a disappointing one, where he started well, he had a few chances, forced Henderson into that save, but aside from that, was very quiet throughout the game, and rightly was replaced by James McCarthy. So once again here, a performance where Townsend, where we really would have liked to have seen more from him in an attacking sense. So now going to move on to the man who most people were talking about before the game, and that is of course Wilfried Zaha, returning to the side, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, once again, reoccurring theme, embarrassing performance from us, and arguably I probably could have given Zaha a 4 for his performance, but I've given him once again benefit of the doubt. I've given him a 5 here, mainly because, yes, he did try, and there was a few times where he was running down the wing, tried his best to cut inside, but most of the time Sheffield United defended well against him, and that was mainly down to a few good challenges, but also just the fact that they put 3 men on him, and it made his life a misery there. And to be honest, you can understand him struggling in them situations when it is almost impossible for you to actually get by because there's 3 players around him. But then on the other side, maybe you've got to try something different. You've got to try maybe cutting inside or putting crosses into the box rather than trying to cut inside yourself. So whilst we could put his bad performance down to the fact that maybe he was getting booed, or the fact that maybe the booing was sort of affecting him, whether it's the fact that they defended well against him, or whether it's just the fact that he weren't really trying anything different, or the fact that that sort of transfer that didn't happen was still playing on his mind. Whatever it was, this was a performance where we didn't see 110%, which we normally, most of the time, do see from Zaha. But once again, like I've said already, I suppose I said it with Townsend as well. When we had the chances to go forward, which of course were very limited in the game, we weren't playing that far up the pitch, which made it life difficult, because as soon as we counter, Sheffield United are able to get back in position and defend well against us. So of course that makes Zaha's life even more difficult, because whenever he gets forward, he just runs into a cul-de-sac of players, and of course Sheffield United regain possession. And I suppose you've got to say that they defended well against him, they dealt with his threat really well, but then you've also got to look at it and go, actually he's meant to be our main man, and sometimes you've just got to adapt to it, and rather than trying to cut inside or play down the middle, just try something different. Put crosses into the box, just ping balls in, or try your luck from distance. Even if it goes over, just try something different. Would have been better from his game. And I'm not really going to talk too much more about him, because of course we could spend all day talking about the transfer rumours about him handing in a transfer request. He appears to have put that behind him now, and he's fully focused on Palace. If you listen to what Townsend said, you listen to what McCarthy said, and if that is the case, that's great. But now he needs to sort of knuckle down and really get back into his form, because this performance here was really lacking, mainly because of the defending against him was really good, but also just the fact that lack of creativity or lack of something different, which really could have helped us through the game. So once again here, Wilfried Zaha playing particularly mainly on the left hand side of our team. I do think the 5 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our starting 11, and that is Christian Benteke, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, in terms of Benteke's performance, he was once again a Marmite player on Twitter. Some people saying obviously his performance was lacking because of obviously it wasn't him playing bad in particular, it was just his teammates around him not giving him the support. But then likewise, people were saying the chances he had, he really should have been doing better, and it was all down on him. So there's two sides to how people look at his performance, and for me personally, I think it's a bit of both, because obviously his teammates could have done so much better in terms of getting that service to him and actually allowing him to have chances on the ball, whereas the other side, you've got to look at it and go, sometimes you're not going to get that much service, so you have to deal with what's given to you. And the few times he did obviously get the ball, he didn't do anything with it, or he didn't do anything spectacular, just gave this possession back to Sheffield United, and of course they were able to restart. So once again, two sides to his performance, but I do think the 5 overall is a fair result. Now, obviously there was one part of his game which I suppose you could pick out, and that was obviously his strength and presence. And all that really done for Palace didn't really allow us to get any clear-cut goal chances or scoring chances, but it just allowed us to win a few free kicks in their own half. So realistically, you want your striker to be involved in the box, trying to win balls and actually, be involved in at least trying to score goals. Whereas his performance as a striker here, his only sort of real contribution seemed to be just him using his natural ability to just keep winning free kicks, and of course the deliveries from them, nothing really came off them, and of course Sheffield United just restarted play. So whilst that was his only good part of his game, the majority of it was obviously quite lacklustre, was lacking. So realistically, I do think the 5 overall is a fair result. Now, of course, quite early on in the game he had a chance, but after that, not really much more of that. And I suppose you can mainly put it down to his service, because of course people like Townsend and Zaha weren't putting the ball into Benteke and we weren't making his life that easy. But then likewise, you've also got to look at it and go, sometimes you've got to adapt, whether that be coming a little bit deeper so you can carry the ball, or whether it be holding it up a bit longer and passing the ball out wide, or at least just saying to a player, okay, you've got to stick with me, give me that support so we can do 1-2s, or whatever you want to do to actually at least get us into these advanced positions. Whereas he just seemed to be stranded, playing up top, no real service there. And of course, like I've said, the only good thing about him was him just winning free kicks, which for our sake, yes, it's great winning free kicks, but nothing came off them anyway. So once again here, disappointing game from Benteke, considering people have been talking about him recently, going maybe he could be going back to his old self. But this was a performance yet again where, yes, he was getting no service, but even the service he did get, he didn't do anything with it. So I do think the 6 overall is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the substitutes we made in the game. Of course, Jeffrey Slarp, James McCarthy and Connor Wickham were the subs. Obviously, Jeffrey Slarp, he was a little bit rusty, came on the pitch, but because it was already 1-0 down and we didn't really have any fight in the whole team, his sort of influence off the bench was quite limited, and it was mainly down to him being rusty. And he's a player who I can understand. He's just come back from an injury. I can understand him not being 100%. But, when you've got players on the field who have had a full pre-season not performing well, you shouldn't really be expecting a half-fit player to come on to make a difference, because a difference should have already been made by the players on the pitch. Now, of course, James McCarthy made his debut for Palace, also going to give him a 5, and that's not just because he was bad, because, if you compare it to other ratings I've given, it makes it seem like he was bad, but I've just given him a 5 because he was on the pitch. For the time he was on the pitch, he showed a little bit of grit and determination, something which of course we were missing early on in the game, and also some nice touches here and there. So whilst he didn't change the game and we didn't get back into the game, just seeing a little bit of determination which was missing so early on in the game, and the fact that the damage was already done meant that he couldn't do much. But if we'd have someone with his determination, or even if we had McCarthy starting in the midfield, could it have been a different result by just having that bit of tenacity in the midfield? Obviously, I'll leave that for you guys to discuss, but you know, the fact that he showed a few nice touches, a bit of grit, you know, that sort of tenacity to put in a tackle. And if you look, there's a picture sort of doing the rounds on Twitter where he's up against sort of face to face with a Sheffield United player, and he's pulling the most sort of disturbing sort of angry face at him. That sort of grit and determination is what we should have seen from every single player on the pitch, because if we showed a little bit more fight, particularly when we went 1-0 down, we maybe could have had a chance to go on and wrestle the game. But because our performance was lacklustre and embarrassing, obviously meant that wasn't the case. And of course, Connor Wickham came on very, very late in the game, couldn't really make an impact, so there's no rating for him there. Now, just obviously a brief sort of summary of the game, and you know, I don't really want to talk about it. It's so disappointing. So, sort of moving swiftly on. Obviously, realistically, when we talk about the game here, the word I could use was bullied, because that's exactly what we were. Sheffield United, give them their due, they were very good, but they didn't win the game because they were good, they just won the game because of how poor we were. And I think bullied is the best way to describe it, because they just took full advantage of us playing no well. And you know, like I've said already, one of the reasons why is we had no desire to actually, obviously in terms of our general play, but in terms of just winning the second balls and just putting in a tackle, putting in a shift wherever you're playing on the field, because we weren't showing that desire. That is why we ultimately lost the game, because at least if we showed a little bit more grit and determination, put Sheffield United under a little bit more pressure offensively, kept putting balls into the box, kept having shots, if we had at least had that a bit of determination, then maybe something better would have come out of the game. And obviously, aside from Sheffield United just playing well, that's why they won. Not just because of how good they were, but because they had that determination. They were working as a team to get the result, which ultimately they did deserve. And of course, once again, talking about individual players, obviously Ward, Kelly, Dan, yes, they were okay for the most part, but they were nothing special. And that sort of lack of concentration a few times, which led to us conceding the goal, or a few times we were put under unnecessary pressure, or you know, times where we're trying to regain possession, we're trying to play the ball out from the back, and Dan and Kelly give the ball away. You know, things like this is why we lost the game. And you know, you've got to also look at Vanano, and you know, obviously the whole defence wasn't that great, but he was absolutely dreadful. Kept giving the ball away, lost everything, wasn't effective going forward, and of course, like I've said already, playing too narrow meant he lost his man for the goal we obviously went on to concede. And I suppose, looking at sort of the complete opposite of that, Milivojevic, who was one of the players who actually had a little bit more desire than some of his teammates. Obviously, he was actually willing to put in a tackle in the midfield, and the fact that it took someone like McCarthy coming off the bench to actually show that he's actually got that desire and he's got that drive to get Palace back into the game is what we really should have instilled and really should have shown early on in the game. And yes, McCarthy looks off the pace, he still doesn't look 100%, but if you've got a player who's sort of 70 to 80% fit and he's still performing better and putting in a determined performance compared to the players starting the game, you've really got to give sort of big questions about, you know, sort of the mentality of the team as a whole. And I suppose what you've got to look at as well is that Townsend as a whole were also not effective. We know how effective they normally are, but once again, if you're going to have the rest of the team not playing well, you need your attacking players to step up and make the difference, and they didn't exactly do that. And of course, as a result of that, Benteke had nothing to work off of, which is obviously a fairly simple thing to say, but it keeps happening week in, week out. People are berating Benteke for not playing well, but it's also down to his teammates not giving him the service he deserved. Now, obviously one player who I haven't really talked about was obviously Jordan Ayew. Didn't play in this game here, but on reflection, it was pretty harsh dropping him, because he played fantastic against Everton. And realistically, I probably, even though I didn't predict it, because I know what Roy Hodgson's like, I would have started him instead of Benteke, because just that energy he brings to the side, that pressing, and just sort of that commitment and sort of energy would have made a real difference. We may not have gone on to win the game, but just having that energy which he showed against Everton, having it in the game here against United, probably would have made so much more different there. And he's probably asking questions like, why was I the man of the match but still didn't get to play in the next game? And I do think Roy Hodgson might change up for the United game, because of course I don't think Benteke is going to do well up against someone like Harry Maguire. So maybe bring in someone like Jordan Ayew, who can just bring that energy to the side, because I think he does deserve to start in the team instead of Benteke. So arguably he's going to be, you know, asking questions as to why he didn't start in this game here. And I suppose, you've got to look at the game as a whole. Obviously, first half we weren't necessarily that bad, but Sheffield United was still by far the best team. But of course, we've come out for the second half. They got the early goal, and we always seem to have a knack of either scoring or conceding late goals or conceding goals sort of just after half time. And this was a game here where we conceded that early goal, and it just seems we're so complacent. We come out for the second half not sort of fully ready for it yet, and we get punished for that. And you've really got to look at it and going, why do we keep conceding after coming out of half time? And why is it that the players seem to switch off after coming off from half time? Because realistically, the team talk should have rifled them up, getting them ready for that second half, come out there more determined, more fight than they had in the first half. But instead, we're very lacklustre and let them score what is a fairly easy goal. But moving aside from that, on to Man United next week. We never get anything at Old Trafford, so realistically, anything other than sort of a 2-0 loss will be a plus. But I personally, considering what United have done recently, obviously put 4 past Chelsea, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But hopefully, touch wood, it isn't a massacre, because obviously at the moment I'm fearing the worst. So obviously this is the part of the podcast where I'd normally go on to sort of nominate 4 players for the Man of the Match award, but realistically after such a poor performance, a really embarrassing one at that, it is really difficult to pick out even one player in particular who I could put forward for the Man of the Match award. But I think the general consensus was obviously comparing my opinion to what was on Twitter, I think we were fairly in agreement. So actually Vicente Guaita was the one player who did stand out, and yes, he arguably should have done better with the goal we conceded rather than parrying it out into the danger area. But actually, on the whole, he was one of the only players actually showing determination, and he was put under so much pressure from the defence not playing well, yet he kept making save after save, keeping us in the game, stopping it from being really a massacre in terms of the chances that Sheffield United had on goal. So realistically, can't really give the Man of the Match award to anyone, but I suppose if we were going to do it, and if there were 4 nominations, for sure Vicente Guaita would have won it, because he put in a very solid performance. And I suppose coming off the bench, you could also say James McCarthy as well, showed that grit and determination, could also be put up for the award. But like I said, after such a disappointing performance, I can't really give out a Man of the Match award because of how embarrassing the performance was. But like I've said, special mentions to obviously Guaita and McCarthy. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my Man of the Match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, Christian Benteke and Jeffrey Slupp following the game.
Thanks for joining us, Christian. Obviously not the result we wanted. How was the 90 minutes for you out there?
I think it's a frustrating afternoon, not just for me but for all the team. We came here with the mindset to get those 3 points, but we didn't get them, and I think it's just a frustrating afternoon because we didn't deserve to win, to be honest, if you look at our second half, but we should have done much better.
It seemed to be a very physical game out there. Obviously you had your chance early on. How hard is it to create opportunities when it is quite a feisty game?
I think that's our problem. I would say we don't create enough chances, and I think it's more about the animation. We have to be more available for each other, and yeah, we have to work on it.
How hard is it starting the away campaign against a newly promoted side? Obviously their first Premier League home game in nearly 13 years. Does that make things difficult?
There is no excuse because we knew that they were going to be extra motivated. They just got in the Premier League, and we knew that was going to be a tough game, tough battle. I think the first half was okay, and the second half was not good enough.
Obviously not the result we wanted, Jeff, but for yourself personally, was it good to return to the squad and get some Premier League minutes for the season?
Yeah. Obviously I've been working hard behind the scenes to try and get fit as quick as possible to try and help the boys. But like you said, weren't the best result or performance that we wanted. But on a personal note, it's good to be back fit to help the boys.
How hard is it to come into a game like that? It seemed quite physical. Half an hour left, you've got to make an impact. Yeah,
we knew it was going to be a difficult game, but obviously, like I just said, it didn't go the way we wanted to. But when the game's like that, it's a bit difficult to get into the pace of it and to get going. But like you said, it was physical, and we learn from these things and we move on.
Focus turns now to Manchester United next weekend. You're looking forward to righting all the wrongs from today with a big away performance?
Yeah, of course. We want to put things right as soon as we can, and that's our next opportunity too. So, we're going to go there ready to go, and obviously try and cause them some problems, and we're going to try and win the game, of course.
We didn't get going in the second half, but in the first half, it wasn't such a poor performance. I thought we were more than worth our 0-0 at half time, and there were moments in around their penalty areas where I thought we might do some damage, getting the ball into Will's feet and Christian's feet. But second half, especially after the goal, we seemed to lose that composure and to some extent some of the passing quality we had in the first half, and as a result it became quite easy for Sheffield United to protect their victory and win the match.
On the face of things, sort of a newly promoted team, but it's quite tough to face them in their first home game, isn't it, particularly when they've had a positive away?
Well, they did what they needed to do. They gave the sort of performance which I'm pretty certain that Chris Wilder was wanting to see from them, so he'll be very happy with his team's performance, and it's got him 3 very important points, whereas of course I can't be happy with the Crystal Palace performance because, as I've just said, we didn't do anywhere near enough in the game, and especially in the second half, to get ourselves back in it and to cause them the sort of problems that I thought we would need to cause them if we were going to get something from the game.
Roy, did you think Wilf got enough protection from the referee in terms of some of the challenges he faced?
I don't want to start after a defeat in a very important home game for Sheffield United, who are back in the Premiership after 12 years, discussing whether players got protection or whether players, were being correctly treated by the referee. We certainly got a lot of free kicks. I thought the referee actually identified the free kicks well, so I didn't think there were many times in the game where I saw a foul against one of our players and the referee didn't give the free kick, so I certainly can't complain. My only regret and complaint, I suppose it is having seen McCarthy's ankle after that very nasty challenge, that got him a yellow card, and I still find it very difficult to understand how someone who's on the end of that type of challenge and gets hurt as badly as he does when they jump up and protest that they get a yellow card. As a football person who's played football and been involved in football for a number of years, I will always find that hard to accept. But having said that, I've got no criticism of the referee's performance at all, and I don't think our players were short of protection, because when they were fouled they got the free kicks.
And the way Wilf carried on to always ask for the ball, and even without success he would carry on and carry on running at them. Does that dispel any kind of myth about his state of mind and the fact that
I'm not prepared to discuss individual players' performances, and furthermore there's always a risk when people make those sort of comments and make those sort of judgments and observations. It's not necessarily certain that they accord with my own, so I certainly don't wish to get involved in them.
Okay, any other questions? Just one more there.
Cheers.
Roy, aside from the fouls, how would you assess Chris Wilder's team's tactics? There's a lot made of this 3-5-2 overlapping centre-backs that they talk about. I'm sure you've seen lots of examples of that in the past, but how do you assess it, and how do you think you dealt with that today?
I thought we dealt with it defensively okay. I mean, I didn't see such an awful lot of overlapping from the centre-backs, if I'm to be brutally honest. I did see a team that works very hard for each other, gets back into shape very quickly, determined in the challenge, determined not to give people time and space in their final third. I saw all of those things, but I don't know that I can make any comments about any particular tactics which are supposedly different to other teams, because I think a lot of the time in the game, especially in the first half, they were defending and making certain that we couldn't get beyond them, and when they did get forward in the wide areas, which we knew would be a problem, for the best part we dealt with it okay. But it's always going to be a problem if you send players forward in the wide areas and you like a cross, and you're a crossing team, then they're going to create some chances. But I think we limited it quite well, and in fact the couple of chances I really remember were a result of technical mistakes. Players that normally are quite good technically, unfortunately losing control of a ball and giving the opponents an opportunity. But that's always going to happen. Technical errors are part of the game.
We'll finish with Joe there.
Roy, obviously your experience, you see most things in the game. When your team is short of confidence in front of goal and struggling to score goals, what can you do as a manager to try and change it?
You do the same, I think, as one always does, and that is to keep working at your game, keep making certain that the movements are right, that we're attacking the right areas, that you're constantly giving people a chance to practice their movements, to practice the quality of their passing and their crosses, because there is no magic wand which changes those things. We've played 2 matches now, 180 minutes, and we haven't scored a goal, and we've conceded 1. And of course we know that you can't win matches by playing 0-0. You've got to score goals to win matches. But I believe that there are players in the team who are capable of scoring goals, and we just have to make certain that we keep working and keep faith with them, and they themselves will have to keep faith in themselves, because unfortunately as a coach all you can do is show your faith in a player to give him support and backing that you think he might need, but it's always the player's job to get out on the field and perform and give the sort of performance that is going to get him the praise that he hopes and he deserves.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, Christian Benteke and Jeffrey Slupp had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Sheffield United. But make sure to comment next week for our post-match review of the game against Manchester United. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.